Capricorn Games by Robert Silverberg is a lesser-known collection of short stories that were written in the early 70s. It was the first Silverberg book that I've read that I didn't really love. It was really uneven. The first half of the book is short stories written in a really new wavy style, and it was at a time in his career when he clearly was burned out, explicitly so, on writing science fiction, and a lot of the content of the stories is just him kind of moaning and kneading his palms together and wanting to escape from the genre, which was kind of funny, I guess, kind of novel, but wasn't my favorite Silverberg. The later stories in the book were great, though. My favorite Silverberg story that I've ever read is Homecoming, which is not in here. It's a book about a man who travels into the future where he co-occupies the mind of a sentient lobster at the bottom of the ocean that goes on a kind of sacred pilgrimage. And there was a little bit of that flavor in the final story. I don't remember the name of it, Ishmael in Love. That's about a dolphin that falls in love with his human trainer and attempts to seduce her. And it's both funny and powerful in the way that Silverberg does so well. And there were a couple other stories that I really loved. There was one, this one, Getting Across, which is a novella set in a dystopian world that was reminiscent of Escape from New York. It was a dystopian world where this giant city is partitioned into different districts, and a man has to travel into a warring, hostile district to retrieve something. It was great. It was great. One of the better little forgotten works of dystopian lit that I've read. And this is an illustrated book. The illustrations were quite good. They all kind of look like tattoos. A lot of it was filler, though. A lot of it I didn't really care for. The style reminded me in places a lot of John Brunner. That's a Stand on Zanzibar reference because that's the one Brunner book that I read. So it reminded me of Stand on Zanzibar. It was uneven, though, hit or miss. I think it's still worth reading because it's Silverberg. I gave this 7 out of 10. The next one I read, that was a random pick. This one was not. It was Two Towers by Tolkien. In the previous video that I released when I was talking about Star of the Unborn by Franz Werfel, I kind of took a shot at Lord of the Rings because I had attempted to read Fellowship of the Ring so many times over the course of my life, and I finally nailed it I guess it was last year. And I never really got the romance with Lord of the Rings. That book is really dry, really long, and it just took me so long to get through it. It was kind of, honestly, a labor of obligation to do it. Wanted to set that stage to say that I was surprised that I really liked this book, which is maybe the most epiphany for a genre reader / booktube watcher. But I was surprised. I was surprised that I really liked it quite a bit. Not all of it, and I didn't love it with a capital L, but it definitely changed my opinion of Lord of the Rings. I would like to read Return of the King and intend to read Return of the King at some point. This is a very different book than Fellowship of the Ring. And obviously I know the history. Lord of the Rings was originally conceived of and written as one volume and then had to be broken up into 3 volumes by the publisher because in their estimation they would not be able to sell the big omnibus tome all in one volume, which is how you can often get it once again these days. So this is just artificially the middle slice of the book. The characters do not feel flat anymore. One of my grievances with the movies is that the Frodo-Sam subplot was really tedious to watch. And I think it has to do with Elijah Wood's acting, and I don't recall the name of the actor who played Sam, but it was really saccharine and unexciting. Very different in the book. The characters are more sophisticatedly conceived of in the book. They have more interesting motivations. They're more fully fleshed out people. The world building is wonderful. There were parts of it where I felt like I was 12 again reading it. Like all the stuff with Mirkwood and the Ents I thought was just beautiful. And a lot of the descriptions of place were great. The descriptions of Mordor, I was amazed by how lyrical Tolkien got in his descriptive language. Didn't expect it out of Tolkien, or maybe I had forgotten that he was capable of it, but there are pieces of real beauty in the language in the book. I also really dug something about the way the characters were portrayed. Something clicked for me, and again, maybe this is like an obvious epiphany for people, but I feel like the way that evil is portrayed in Two Towers is really interesting and intelligent and reflective of evil as I have encountered it and observed it in the world. I feel like all of the foil characters are their own little studies in people's motivations and moral failings. Gollum, who is a wonderful character in this book, really interesting, compelling character. You know, there's the evil of selfishness, and it's just such a great little nutshell, a little perfect encapsulation of a part of human nature, of the simultaneous extreme selfishness that's couched in an air of, or like this narrative of being a martyr. Saruman is a way more interesting character in the book than he is in the movie. This is plural, where you can tell that he has an internal conflict, that he wants to be talked out of his poor decisions and his poor alliance. Kind of like, Darth Vader or Return of the Jedi. He wants to be saved, but ultimately is not brave enough to be saved and to admit his own folly, and then suffers the consequences. Sauron himself is not that interesting. It's just kind of the point source, the absolute evil. My favorite part was there's a dialogue between some orc sergeants or lieutenants or something at the end of the book who encounter one another and are kind of shit-talking each other and complaining about being at work, complaining about receiving stupid orders and having to go on marches and waiting for the war to be over, and talking about how mistreated they are by the big powers. And one of the orcs says that he plans to run away to some distant land to start a farmstead where he can be away from all of the affairs of the political movers and shakers of the world. I thought it was just wonderful. It was such a great little humane touch that Tolkien included, and it was very funny. The spider demon Shelob, however it's pronounced, I thought was great. There were just a few moments, a few passages where my eyes kind of glazed over. It didn't really captivate me, but it charmed me. It really did charm me, and it won me over. I'm not a huge fantasy reader, but I feel no need to cast aspersions on this in the way that I felt compelled to with Fellowship of the Ring. I gave this, I think, a 7 out of 10, and I will definitely complete Lord of the Rings at some point. The next one was a random pick, the best of Robert Bloch, in this Del Rey Best of series. Robert Bloch is famous for being the screenwriter of Psycho, and most of these are horror stories. He mostly wrote horror. He wrote also, I believe, crime fiction and a little bit of science fiction. It's basically only horror and SF in this collection. For most of the book, it was vanilla to the point of comedy. Most of these were written in the late 30s through early 70s, I think, and the earlier stories were about as cliche of horror stories as you could maybe imagine, or as I could imagine. Like, they were written to be turned into whatever, like Outer Limits episodes. Pretty lame. A lot of puns, a lot of alliteration. The copy on the back, actually, I just remembered, is really funny. A fiendish feast for all mavens of the macabre and addicts of the arcane, served up by the Shah of Shudders himself, Robert Bloch. So stuff like that. There's one story in here that is like knocked it out of the park. Feels like it was written by a completely different writer. I think it's The Funnel of God. Yes, The Funnel of God. It's about a boy who encounters an elderly shaman in the wilderness in apartheid South Africa. It's astonishing. It's so incredibly good. I wrote in my little notes that reads like it was written by Grant Morrison. Definitely worth finding. The rest of it I could kind of take or leave. There's a couple little cosmic horror or weird fiction bits and bobs that were kind of interesting, but for the most part, pretty forgettable. I bumped this up to a 6 out of 5 from a 5 out of 5 just because of that one story. I would just read that one. It's called Funnel of God. Another random pick, Helliconia Spring by Brian Aldiss. This is the second Brian Aldiss that I have read. The first one was Hot House. As you can tell, this is a longer, bigger book than Hot House, which is one of those nice, thin, little 200 pagers. Hot House, rip-roaring, hell of a time, whitewater rafting trip. This is a slow trip down a long river, and this is book 1 of 3. I feel very mixed things about Helliconia Spring, generally positive, but I have to talk about them, I think, after I talk about the negatives. The negatives are, it is excruciatingly slow. The prologue is 100 pages long, and a lot of science fiction books, especially harder science fiction books, have an adjustment period. I think there might actually be a term for it in genre fiction. The adjustment period up front, where you're kind of getting your sea legs, you're understanding the rules that the author is setting down for how the universe of the book operates and introducing the characters. It can be a little bit of a heavier press than with literary fiction, where you don't have to adjust to different physics or a different set of technological abilities or whatever. So it can be a little exhausting. I think it's one of the things that turns people off of reading science fiction. It's brutal in this book. I think it's maybe the harshest landing of any book, other than maybe Blindsight and Fire Upon the Deep, but those are more brief. This is not as hard to understand, but there's something about the world building that is just glacially, no pun intended, slow. If you've read the book, it's about a planet, like an ice planet, that's populated with very primitive human tribes at slightly different levels of technological advancement based on where they live, who cohabitate the planet with a race of big, shaggy, behorned aliens called Phagors, who have an interesting relationship with the planet itself and with the humans that, as you could guess, becomes more complex over the course of the story. And the main plot follows a couple of different generations of human settlers that live in an ancient stone city on this plain next to a river, who are attempting basically just to survive at a kind of, I want to say, not even Bronze Age level of tech, like Stone Age level of technology that slowly develops over the course of the book to become more and more advanced as they cultivate more technological prowess. The characters are both not that unique and also are very, very well written. These feel like genuine people with complicated emotions. There are some misdirects with the character work. You expect certain resolutions to certain relationships that don't happen. People make mistakes. People are selfish and petty. It's a brutally violent world, but also the same characters that are brutal are also capable of great acts of kindness and tenderness. It shares a lot of DNA with Game of Thrones. It also feels, excuse me, a lot like Dune and quite a bit like Left Hand of Darkness. If it weren't for the pacing issue, I would consider this on par with those books. He's kind of writing at that level, but he's not. It's like he's in a NASCAR. He is driving a NASCAR that is just as capable of going fast as a Frank Herbert NASCAR or a Le Guin NASCAR, but he's stuck in like third gear and he can't get out of it. And I don't know if he was deliberately trying to pace himself more slowly for this series because he was so accustomed to writing the snappier, shorter books, because from my experience, almost all of his books that I've come across are sub 250 pages. I don't know if that was the case or what, but this was later in his career. He wrote in this stately way. I do recommend that you read it. And I would like to finish out the series because it goes to really interesting places. It does pretty amazing things with the world building. There's a little bit of, there's like this one conceit, I will say one conceit that recurs at around the 1/3 mark, and it just kind of pops in every once in a while and interrupts the narrative. And it feels dumb to me. It doesn't feel like it fits. I think it's a way to kind of shoehorn some exposition into the story, and it detracts from the story. But maybe it pays off farther down the line. There's some great stuff, little details of fantasy that are worked into the science fiction. It reads like a science fantasy. In fact, it reads like a Conan book. It reads like it reads like a fantasy book more than like a science fiction book. I assume that those fantasy conceits pay off in later books as science fiction phenomena. For being a painfully slow and dull book, it was amazingly good. I know that might be a little confusing, but I gave this 8 out of 10 because it overcomes its own limitations for the most part. Finally, The Invincible by Stanislaw Lem, which has a great cover. I picked this not randomly because I just wanted to have a palate cleanser after that long saga of a book. Wanted something punchy and quick and that I felt would kick ass. So I picked this. It didn't kick as much ass as I had hoped. Certainly not a bad book. I consider it kind of elevated pulp. I thought when reading it that it was from the earliest period of Lem's career as a novelist because it just doesn't have the same sense of gravitas as his other books that I've read. I've read Solaris, obviously, and I've read Futurological Congress. Both of them feel a little more advanced than The Invincible. The plot is about a starship that goes to retrieve or investigate the disappearance of the crew of another starship that lands on a barely explored planet, desert planet, and the crew of the ship find the ruins of the old ship and everybody is dead, and they have to figure out why. And there's some great, like, spooky kind of H.R.R. Giger type ambiance and little eerie details in the world building, and there's a hostile element afoot on the planet. I won't spoil what it is. That's kind of interesting, not super compelling. The characters, there really are two characters with a supporting cast of kind of NPC, forgettable, interchangeable crew members and scientists. The two main characters are the protagonist, who's the second in command, and then the commanding officer, who's this old hard ass. And the commanding officer is a fascinating character. It's a great little study in kind of the art of command. And the protagonist is not all that interesting or compelling. The language was not nearly as beautiful as it was in those other two books, and especially not in Solaris, and it was immediately noticeable. It was short, declarative sentences that were fairly unadorned in the beginning, and then it kind of opens up and relaxes the second part of the book. I suspected that maybe it was a translation issue, and indeed, this is the older translation by Wendane Ackerman, which was translated off of the German translation, so it went from Polish to German to English. The other two that I've read were both direct Polish to English, and there's a new translation of this that is Polish to English. So I would guess that that one is probably better to read than this one. So it's hard to gauge on its literary merits on those grounds. So just in terms of the thematics and kind of the action, it was good. It wasn't great. It shared quite a bit with Solaris, both in terms of actual pieces of action were very close symmetry between the two of them, and the themes were similar. It was interesting. It was an early depiction of nanotechnology and an early depiction of exploration via drone. So parts of the technology feel really dated. They use, I think, reels, like magnetic reels, microfilm, stuff like that. But there are pieces of it that feel quite prescient and contemporary. It's a quick read. It's certainly not bad. Weirdly, they're making a video game out of it. I watched the clip online. I don't know how good it looks. I don't really know anything about video games anymore. But I do recommend it if you can find it. The cover's great, and B, you can read it in like one day or so. And it's certainly not bad. I gave this one a 7 out of 10. So I usually don't do this, but I'm going to call the next 5. I've decided to do a run of the big 3. I'm picking 5, have picked 5 of the hard SF classics that I have just not gotten to, like required reading books. Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke, which I have actually already finished. I'm currently reading 2001 by Clarke. Then, in some order to be determined, probably in the order that I'm telling you now, Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein. Giving the old boy another shot. I figure that's my best shot at finding a Heinlein that I'm going to connect with. And then I, Robot or I, Robot in the original pronunciation by Asimov, and probably The Gods Themselves by Asimov. So that'll be the next 5. Thank you for watching.